Hello everyone and welcome to another video. A lot of things in RollerCoaster Tycoon are timed. You have a certain number of years to complete a goal, rides have a certain profit per hour, staff have a monthly wage, guests get annoyed if a ride is too long, and so on. But even though it seems quite straightforward, a lot of these things are not what they appear to be. One instance of the word hour may not mean the same length of time as a different instance of it. In this video we will go through all dimensions of time spans in this game and see what an incredible mess time actually is in RollerCoaster Tycoon 2. Now, firstly, there's a kind of a different aspect, which is that there are two different time scales in this game. There is the in-game time, which are the days, weeks, months and years that the game refers to, and then there's also real time, which you get when you look at things like ride duration and profit. The combination of these two different time scales leads to the funny observation that guests will stay in the park for many years at a time, which is of course completely nonsensical. However, I would not consider this to be a mistake or to be wrong, and it's not what I'm referring to in this video. Having two different time scales does make sense, and realism is not the goal of the game. What I do want to talk about is when two different instances of the same time unit are actually different, such as the term week. Most of the time when the game mentions weeks, such as for advertising or the weekly profit graph, they actually mean a quarter of a month. A month is either 30 or 31 days, so a week is either 7.5 or 7.75 days depending on the month. While this is obviously slightly longer than the 7-day week we are all used to, it does make sense for easy calculation, so I don't think it's wrong. Except for the fact that there is also a case where it is exactly 7 days. There are a couple of scenarios where you are not allowed to let your park rating go below 700, otherwise your park will close and you will lose. There is some leeway though, and if this happens you have 4 weeks to get it above the threshold again to reset that timer, and this time it is exactly 28 days and not a full month. In these scenarios the first month is not counted, so if you don't do anything in a park like Arid Heights, you will get the first warning on April 1st, and exactly when the date ticks over to April 29th, the park will close down and you'll lose. We're only just getting started, and the differences between these 2 weeks is a relatively tame example. Before we go any further, we should talk about how the game actually gets its own internal clock completely wrong. The very smallest base time unit of RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 is called a Gametick, and there are 40 Gameticks every single second. That means that things in the game like vehicle position, guest position and the graphics are updated at most 40 times a second. Sometimes less if there's no need to update that frequently, like the guest hunger for example, but never more. Using this 40 ticks per second, the game can calculate how many seconds or minutes something takes. If a ride, for example, takes 800 game ticks to complete, then that is a 20-second ride duration, as 800 divided by 40 is 20. That's all great and works perfectly fine, except for the fact that all the other functions in the code do not know that there are 40 ticks in a second and instead think that there are only 32. This is most easily proven by seeing how long this rollercoaster with a 20-second ride duration actually takes to complete. It should be 20 seconds as the game tells us that, but actually it's only about 16 seconds. It works as follows. The game measures this ride to be 640 game ticks long, which with 40 ticks per second is a duration of 16 seconds. However, the code that shows us the ride time actually divides it by 32 and gets a result of 20 seconds. And this very same mistake happens in many other places all over the game. One of those places is the minimum and maximum waiting time. If you set the minimum to 60 seconds, it will actually wait for only 48 seconds. The game keeps track of how many game ticks the train has waited for and then compares that to the waiting time set by the player to see if it should depart. But in this process it multiplies the amount of seconds you have set by 32 instead of the correct 40, leading to the exact same error. Another place this mistake shows up is the number of customers per hour. This is calculated by using the number of customers in the past 5 minutes and then multiplying that by 12. Those 5 minutes are subdivided into 10, so that number is updated 10 times every 5 minutes or once every 30 seconds. So far so good, that's all fine, but here is where it goes wrong. 30 seconds is 1200 game ticks, so this function should be called every 1200 ticks, but rather it's called every 960 ticks, which would be 30 seconds if the game ran at 32 ticks per second. But in our 40 tick world this is actually only 24 seconds. Once again, that's the very same discrepancy, and it means that when a ride says it's having 1,000 customers an hour, it's actually telling you it's having 1,000 customers every 48 minutes, or when you go the other way, 1,250 guests per hour. Since the hourly ride income is simply the customers per hour multiplied by the ride ticket price, this number is also per 48 minutes. Well, actually it can be much more severely wrong, but we'll get into that later. I have a feeling that this mistake is caused by a change in the tick speed of the game during development. This is all speculation of course, I don't know for sure, but I think originally the game did run at 32 ticks per second and all these functions were accurate. But then Chris Sawyer decided to for some reason speed up the game a bit and make it 40 ticks per second instead, and forgot to update all the functions that rely on the tick speed to calculate the real time something has taken. By the way, the bits of code that I'm showing you is of course not the original assembly code of RCT1 and 2, but rather the code of OpenRCT2, which is a lot more human readable. I did double check if all these things work the same in vanilla and are wrong in the same way and are not an implementation mistake by OpenRCT2, and yeah, they do all work the same. This is not the only way that the displayed time can be wrong though, and actually not a single one of the displayed times is accurate, with all of them being wrong in their own unique way. Take the airtime for example, which is usually not more than a few seconds, except that these seconds are wrong. To measure the airtime, the game simply keeps track of how many game ticks the vertical g-forces on the ride are 0 or less. That's simple enough and works fine for calculating the ride stats, but to display this to the masses it will have to be converted to real time. How does the game do this? By multiplying by 3 and then putting the final 2 digits behind a decimal point. So if you have 40 ticks or 1 second of airtime, this turns into 120, which is displayed as 1.20 seconds of airtime. That is again incorrect, but slightly differently than before. Whereas the customers per hour number is actually per 48 minutes, one displayed hour of airtime would actually be 50 minutes. I suspect though that this too is impacted by the 32 versus 40 ticks problem. Right now 1 second is wrongly displayed as 1.2 seconds, but if there were 32 ticks in a second it would have been 0.96 seconds. That's still incorrect, but a lot closer to reality. Next up are the time a guest has spent in the park and the time since the last ride inspection. These two use the same method to get to the same wrong conclusion. Every certain number of ticks, the amount of minutes since the last inspection is increased by 1, and the minutes that the guest has spent in the park is calculated by dividing how many game ticks they have been around by that same number. What is this number? 2048. That is a really easy number for computers to deal with, so it makes sense, but there are not 2048 game ticks in a minute, there are actually 2400. So for these two values, if you see them say 60 minutes or 1 hour, then it actually only has been 51 minutes and 12 seconds. And once again, this would have been closer to reality if there were 32 ticks per second, as that would result in 1 hour being 64 minutes. It's still wrong, but it's less wrong. The inspection interval, which you should always set to the minimum of 10 minutes, is wrong in the exact same way, and the 10 minutes is only about 8.5 minutes. And then there are the ride running costs. They are listed immediately below the ride income, but these 2 hours do not mean the same length of time. As we saw earlier, the income hour actually means 48 minutes, but the running costs hour is a few minutes longer than that. You pay these running costs twice a month, and the game only stores that amount that you need to pay. To convert it to the hourly cost, it multiplies it by 16 to get the total running costs that you pay over 1 full year. How long is a year? It's close to 1 hour, so it's not a bad approximation, but it's not exactly right either. In total there are 2 to the power 17 or 131,072 game ticks in one RCT year. This is equivalent to 54 minutes and 36.8 seconds. So, after having an hour that lasts 48 minutes, one that's 50 minutes and one that's 51.2 minutes, we now also have one that's about 54.6 minutes. The profit per hour that is listed below here is calculated by simply subtracting the running costs from the income. It makes sense to do it like that, but since these are actually 2 different time units, the actual ride profit could be anything between 48 minutes and 54.6 minutes, depending on the ratio between the income and running costs. If there is no income at all, then the profit is per 54.6 minutes, same as the running costs, and then as the income increases, the hour slowly shrinks towards being 48 minutes long. So far we have discussed several different hours that are wrong, but not too wrong, as they're all within 25% of actually being an hour long. But that does not go for the next one. The ride window will tell you how long the queue time of the ride is in minutes. This updates with every guest that walks through the entrance, and it is simply how many minutes that guest has queued for. This is saved separately per station, and if the ride has multiple stations, it will show the longest of them. That's all fine, but there are two problems. To keep track of how long the guest has queued for, it uses the number of in-game days. At the start of every day, this number increases by 1, and then you can perform some math on it to convert it to real time. The first problem is that right before this calculation it adds 3 extra days, meaning it's always 1 or 2 minutes too high, and even with 0 queue time at all it still shows a queue time of 1 minute. It can also say 0 minutes, but that's only if no one has ridden it yet. Once anyone rides it, it can never say 0 minutes again. The second and bigger problem is that this conversion is completely and entirely inaccurate. One in-game day is about 13.5 seconds long, so dividing the number of days by 4 puts about 54 seconds in a minute. That's quite close to the truth, and 4 is a fast division, so that would make sense. But no, we don't do that, and instead we divide by only 2 and make the shortest minutes ever, with them being only 27 seconds long. And that means that when this says 60 minutes, 1 hour, then in real time they've only waited for about 27 minutes. The reason I'm saying about 27 minutes and are not giving you an exact number is the fact that the length of an RCT day is not even constant and depends on the month. A month is always 409.6 seconds long, so months with 31 days will have days that are 13.21 seconds long, and months with 30 days have longer days at 13.65 seconds. That means that depending on the month you could get slightly different values for the same length of time. It's only 1 minute difference at the most, but it's still weird. But not as weird as the fact that this time is always off by more than a factor of 2, except for when there's no waiting time at all, then it overestimates the waiting time by saying 1 minute instead of 0. Another thing that's wrong is the combination of vehicle speed and ride length that the game gives you. These things can be quite complicated if you go deep into it, and I'm not gonna do that in this video, but I will show you one example of how incredibly wrong this can be. On this coaster the train is traveling at 43 km per hour on these boosters. Every now and then the speed will flicker to 41 briefly, but it's close enough to 43 to take that as the truth in this example. I have painted a section of 200 tiles with a different terrain color, and when I time how long the train takes to complete that section, I coincidentally get roughly 43 seconds. But how long is the physical length of 200 tiles of straight track? Well, this ride has 2 parts, and the other section is exactly those 200 tiles long, which the ride tells us is 853 meters. With some math we can calculate that 853 meters travelled in 43 seconds requires a velocity of 71 km an hour, a far cry from the reported 43. If you do the calculation the other way and keep the 43 the same, then in this case it's not 43 km per hour, but rather 43 km per 36 minutes. Part of this could be explained by the 32 versus 40 ticks problem, but even when you correct for that, it's still only 43 km per 45 minutes and not per hour. You could also argue that it's the length that is wrong and not the speed, but whatever exactly the cause is, something is very incorrect here. We have now discussed all instances of real time being visible in the games and have gotten lots of different definitions of how long 1 hour is, ranging from about 27 minutes to 54.5. But there are still more instances of in-game time that are wrong, just like the weeks that we started with. Let's see what happens when I take out a 2-week advertising campaign. It is currently the 4th of March, so this campaign should end on about the 19th, as weeks are 7.75 days long in months with 31 days. But what actually happens is that it runs until the 24th, a full 20 days instead of the promised 15.5 days. That is because the game cannot just measure these weeks at any time. They always begin at the start, a quarter, halfway or 3 quarters into the month, and the campaign timer doesn't start counting down until the start of the next week. We bought this campaign on the 4th of March, but that is halfway the first week, and the second week doesn't start until it's nearly the 9th of March, which is when the countdown starts. That means that you always get between nothing and a full week for free, and if you fully optimize this by only buying 2-week advertising campaigns at the perfect time, then you can make that number incorrect by 33%, as you actually get 3 weeks. But why don't ad campaigns just use the flexible week system that the cannot let your rating go below 700 scenario goal uses? Those weeks can start and end at any time and last exactly 7 days each. They would be perfect. I suspect that is because the 4 rigid weeks per month system was implemented from the very start in the RCT1 base game, and back then the 700 park rating scenario goal did not exist yet. When that goal type was implemented in the expansions, Chris Sawyer decided that he needed more flexible weeks for it, but also decided to not change any already existing game mechanics that use the rigid quarter-month weeks. The right age is wrong in the exact opposite way to ads, where you can get screwed out of some time instead of getting extra. The age is displayed in years, but internally the game keeps track of it more granularly and it goes down to the individual month. It needs to do this to know when the park value it provides and the maximum ticket price that guests will want to pay for it should go down, as for example the first decrease is after 5 months. My problem is not with the fact that the displayed age is quite imprecise and rounded down to the nearest year, that's fine with me. No, the problem is rather that the number of months is, well, wrong. This number goes up by 1 every month, obviously, but instead of keeping track on what day the ride is built, it simply increases by 1 every time a new month starts. That means that a ride built near the end of a month will turn 1 month old pretty much immediately, and that also means that the first drop in ride value occurs anywhere between 4 and 5 months, instead of always exactly after 5 months. But what about the staff costs? Every staff member has a certain monthly wage that you unfortunately need to pay because of those stupid labor laws. Are those numbers correct? Yes, they are. For once, it's not a lie. These are exactly what they promise, and the same goes for the research costs. What is a lie though is the loan interest. Here we have a loan interest of 5% per year on a €20,000 loan. That means we should pay €1,000 per year, which with 8 months per year is €125 a month. But that is not what we pay, and we actually pay just €122 per month, slightly less. You pay interest 4 times a month, which is 32 times a year, and that amount is calculated as follows. The game takes the loan amount and multiplies it by the percent points of interest, so 20,000 times 5, which is 100,000. This is now 100 times the yearly interest you should pay, so to get the correct singular payment, of which there are 32 a year, you should divide by 3200. However, what the game actually does is multiplying by 5 and then dividing by 16,384, which is the same as dividing by 3276.8, a slightly too high number. And that is why you pay ever so slightly less loan interest than the game tells you that you are paying. This multiplying by 5 and then dividing by 16,384 instead of just dividing by 3200 is again because it's really easy and fast for computers to do. Dividing by powers of 2, which 16,384 is, can be done via something called bit shifting, where you basically just discard a bunch of digits off the end of your binary number, which is a lot faster than actual division. The €500,000 we got right before the division is actually represented as 5 million, as the game counts in units of 10 cents. 16,384 is 2 to the power 14, so we can just delete the final 14 digits and what remains is 305 in binary, which represents the €30.50 we pay 4 times a month. Multiplying two numbers is a lot easier than dividing, so the extra multiplying by 5 that we need to do first is still a lot faster than doing no multiplication and dividing by a more tricky 3200 instead. It's the same as dividing by 10 for humans, since we work in a system with 10 digits. If you need to, for example, divide 2,364,237 by 1000 and round down, you just delete the final 3 digits and you're done. Bit shifting in computers does the same thing, but with binary numbers. This extra speed was very important when this game had to run on what even 25 years ago was already considered a potato PC. Yeah, it's slightly wrong, but it will allow more people to play and enjoy the game. And who outside of some nerd who looks at this game for a living would even notice it? Finally, there is what I alluded to earlier, the complete mess that a ride or stall income is. We already know that it's wrong and that it's actually per 48 minutes instead of per hour, but it can be so much more wrong than that. Firstly, for stalls that sell 2 items, the game simply uses the average profit per item of the 2 to calculate the income. This info kiosk gives out maps for free, but has the umbrella price way too high for anyone to buy it when it's not raining. It is actually losing a bit of money for every map sale, but the game tells you that it's making a massive profit anyway. And of course, once everyone has a map and it starts raining, the profit suddenly becomes underreported, as people are only buying umbrellas now, so the profit per item sold is much higher than the average of the 2 items. The other way this goes wrong, in an equally terrible way, is rides with photo sections. Here it already starts with an incorrect number for the customers per hour, as the riders and photos sold are just added together. About 10% of the roughly 2700 guests per hour on this micro corkscrew are on-ride photos that are sold. You could technically argue that this is a correct number, but then this is multiplied with the ride ticket price to get the hourly income, even though 10% of those customers are actually a slight loss, as I do not charge anything for the photos. And these photos are not taken into account at all, so no matter how much or little you charge, the displayed income will not change. Well, unless you charge so much that fewer people will buy a photo, as then the customers per hour number will go down. This also leads to the fact that if you make the ride free, but do charge for photos, you can be making a profit while the game tells you that you have no income and are losing money on the running costs every hour. OpenRCT2 has been trying to improve this calculation by also including the profit from photos. It does this by dividing the amount of photos sold by the amount of riders the ride has had and using that as an estimation of how many photos you are currently selling. That's not a bad idea and it works fine if the circumstances don't change over time, but it can lead to a very weird situation if, for example, the ride is free and you're now charging $20 for a photo. That should give us no income, as the photos are way too expensive to sell any, but because the price was lower in the past, we have already sold a bunch of photos, and therefore the income display thinks we are still selling them and wrongly displays an income. There is a comment in the OpenRCT2 code about changing this to only use the amount of riders and photos sold in the past 5 minutes, so if you're watching this video in the future, then this calculation could be more accurate. And maybe the other problems with the ride and stall income calculations and perhaps other things we've talked about in this video will be solved as well. Who can tell? We have now talked about a lot of different wrong numbers, from an hour meaning 6 different time durations of which none are 60 minutes, to several financial transactions being calculated incorrectly. I think this video can be summarized as follows. It's okay to be a little bit wrong if that makes the game run better, but there are also a bunch of genuine and sometimes hilarious mistakes made. And that's all there is to say. I hope you found this interesting, and if you did, you can click here to learn all about how ride breakdowns work. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.